John Keppler from Enviva. John has started this company 16 years ago, and it's now $1 billion operation and the world's largest producer of wood pellets. So without more, John, you have 20 minutes, including questions. Thank you.
Well, David and Peter, thank you very much. And what a remarkable track record to have this be the 20th anniversary of what seems to be just a fantastic summit. So thank you for including me. I think it will, the context of where we all sit in the broader environment today will certainly not be a surprise to anyone. As a nation, we're coming off a week, last week, celebrating sustainability, which was punctuated by the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. For those who spend a lot of time thinking about trees, you'll also note that today is Arbor Day, really a reminder of just how important trees are, and certainly ever more important in the fight against climate change. For those who are more familiar with Enviva, you'll note that 6 years ago yesterday, the units of Enviva Partners LP began trading on the New York Stock Exchange. And that's really quite a confluence of events. And again, one of the real privileges I have of being with you this morning. Because when we launched the company, I think few could have really understood the importance that the sustainable biomass business that we set out to build would ultimately have on the global and urgent effort to fight climate change, principally by helping countries around the world, ones that now include the United States, quite proudly, to help reach their goal of very substantial and dramatic emissions reductions, in many cases a net zero target. Given that most folks on the call are members of the investment community, for those who are new to the Enviva story, of course, you can find out more information about us in our 10Q and earnings release, which were filed yesterday. For our first quarter, we're very, very proud to report that against the continued backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, we announced our 23rd consecutive distribution increase, reaffirmed our full year guidance for the year, and again, really demonstrated a pretty remarkable track record of total shareholder return since we launched the company and went public about 6 years ago. The question that we often get asked is, how have we built a renewable energy company with this stability and durability that continues to persist even against pretty challenging headwinds of the broader coronavirus pandemic? What's going on? What makes you unique, and why are you so important to the future? And the way I characterize it is that we're a company, and it's great to be a part of the technology component of this week's discussion, because we're a company that really is an enabler of so many new innovations in technology, and also an evolution of things being done in traditional ways. And what I like to tell people is we do very traditional things in non-traditional ways. And so for context, like many energy companies, Enviva is one that aggregates a natural resource. We upgrade it, we process it, we terminal it, and we distribute it to customers around the world who use it to generate power and heat. The big difference is that the natural resource that we aggregate is wood fiber. It's a renewable resource. And so our customers use the product that we manufacture as a drop-in substitute for coal. And so it's a very cost-effective, it's a very quick and efficient means for large-scale power generators around the world to take existing infrastructure and recycle it into not fossil fuel-based generation, but renewable-based generation. So preserving jobs, preserving grid stability, preserving the very assets that have helped underpin the electrification of so many economies. And now we're able to do so, really mitigating against the intermittency of solar and wind, and oftentimes acting as a force multiplier for those renewable resources. We operate a whole portfolio of what would, from the conventional energy sector, be largely viewed as midstream assets. We own processing assets, we own terminal facilities across the Southeast United States. Why the Southeast United States? Because that's the most robust natural resource basin for wood fiber. It's affectionately known historically as the Saudi Arabia of wood. It's why the forest products around the world, about 1/5 of those are produced right here in the Southeast US. And unlike the traditional energy sector, this is a negative depleting resource. More grows every single year than is harvested. That's not new. That's been the story of the Southeast US for the last 150 years. And I'll spend a little bit of time this morning talking about why that continues to be the case and why Enviva continues to be such an important part of that. So from this footprint across the Southeast US, where we're aggregating wood fiber, typically low-grade residual wood that occurs after a very traditional saw timber harvest, we upgrade that and we process that into wood pellets that we sell to customers principally in Europe and Asia under long-term energy supply contracts. These are contracts that go out 10, 15, in some cases as far out as 25 years, where utilities are, as I mentioned, using this as a direct drop-in substitute for coal. The scale of the company, the 9 plants we operate today produce about 5.5 million tons of wood pellets per year. With what we're building, that grows to about 7 million tons per year. And these are contracts that in the aggregate have a weighted average contract backlog of about $20 billion of firm deliveries that we're obliged to help deliver to customers around the world, a weighted average contract maturity of about 14 years. And in our customers, by the utilization of this renewable resource, after netting back all of the supply chain emissions and the deliveries from here in the Southeast US to places as far flung as Japan, as well as the Netherlands and Denmark and places across continental Europe, they're able to displace the equivalent coal emissions on about an 85% life cycle basis. So a very, very compelling tool in the policymaker's arsenal for reaching dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But why now? Why is Enviva important? What's the relevance? And as you heard me say, that although our business is based here in the Southeast US, our business is quite global. And so I have the privilege of being with regulators and policymakers around the world who really have a quite common refrain. It's quite simple that we can't goal our way to net zero. We can't science paper our way to achieving mitigation of climate change. We actually need partnerships with companies and industry to take action and affect change. That's where the emissions get reduced, is by action and change. And of course, as we all are familiar, the need is now. And so as we have been able to create and help foster a technology revolution in what was kind of a non-traditional way, where you've got major power generators and heat generators around the world converting existing assets and infrastructure in these large-scale stations into wood pellets, they're able to very quickly and effectively, as I mentioned, make a dramatic impact on climate change. And so our markets have continued to grow very rapidly. This is a market that has grown at about a 20% CAGR year on year. That's one that's forecast to continue to grow quite robustly as new significant commitments to net zero occur very frequently. And obviously the policymaking mechanisms around the world are some of the key enablers to that. But with this significant growth, what I would say is also comes significant responsibility, especially when the natural resource that we work with is itself such an important part of mitigating climate change, right? Forests, healthy, growing forests can be incredible carbon sinks. The UN IPCC, the world's leading authority, the key advisor to policymakers and regulators around the world about the best pathways to mitigating climate change, would describe the role of forests quite holistically. And they would say that a sustainable forest management strategy, their words, aimed at maintaining and increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual yield of timber, fiber, and energy from the forest, generates the largest sustained climate change benefit. So every single pathway articulated by the UN IPCC to mitigate climate change to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius requires more utilization of working forest resources than we do today. So how does that really work? How can you be using more of something and still get and find yourself generating more of that resource? Well, that's the beauty of working healthy forests. Demand for forest products creates an investor response for investment in forest resources. That's why the Southeast US has been such a robust natural resource for the world's fiber needs for as long as it has been. And the markets that we create for the very low value wood, the tops, the limbs, the byproducts, all the understory that would otherwise be left in the forest after a traditional saw timber harvest for things like dimensional lumber, telephone poles and the like, that themselves become permanent carbon storage. That holistic cycle is very, very beneficial to long-term forest health. And the data is quite impressive. And we as the world's leader in the particular area of bioenergy that we operate in, we're fastidious in the data that we both aggregate, collect, and very, very transparently disclose. We innovated and developed a proprietary track and trace system that quite literally tracks every single ton of wood fiber from that forest floor, from the ownership, the track size, all of the track characteristics, any of the biodiversity characteristics, species, mix, age, the full characteristics. We track and trace, and before we procure any wood fiber, ensure that it conforms to our responsible wood sourcing policy. But then we track that, and we publish all of our supply chain data transparently, so that any of our stakeholders can inquire as to the source of the wood fiber that we aggregate. And here's what that data tells us. Of the thousands of tracks from which we have procured low-grade wood fiber over the last decade, about 30% of that volume comes to people like Enviva. Again, that low grade, the tops, the limbs, everything that isn't a high-value merchandisable product, while the 70% goes to places like sawmills. And while we have produced about 21 million tons of wood pellets in the time since we began operations, in our own catchment area, so just where we procure wood from, 300 million tons of trees are growing in excess of all of the demand on that forest resource that has occurred during the same time. So we in the entire forest products industry have, of course, removals from that resource. At the same time, during that period, there's now 300 million more tons than there were before. That's because forest markets matter. And the incentives that are inherent to when there's value placed on a natural resource, people will curate and care for that value. And so that data, I think, makes every one of our stakeholders very, very proud of the role that we play in displacing coal and helping grow more trees and fighting climate change. And so this very holistic cycle naturally incents greater demand for our product. And so what you see around the world is bioenergy as a critical resource used in displacement of fossil fuels and a broader energy transition. Folks may not be aware that 60% of renewable energy in Europe is actually bioenergy based. That's a critical reason why the EU taxonomy, which is the underpinning for the green investment strategy within the broader EU, the manner in which they intend to finance investment in the Green New Deal. Biomass right alongside solar and wind are recognized as substantial contributors to the mitigation of climate change on a long-term basis. And that's because the role of biomass and the role of our wood pellets in existing large-scale power and heat stations means that we can mitigate the intermittency associated with solar and wind. And just as importantly, solves the very difficult energy generation challenge of heat generation. Geothermal is a fantastic resource, but it's very location specific. Whereas biomass and some of the emerging approaches to utilization of biomass do not have to be specific geological formation dependent, and rather can be utilized not only in power and heat generation, but increasingly as enablers to decarbonization of the broader industrial sector. And here's what's so exciting is that the building blocks that are inherent in the carbon chains inside wood can be reconstituted for things like chemicals, for the aromatic, the BTX, the plastics, the things that are very, very difficult to achieve on a non-fossil fuel basis. Today, we have customers emerging, not just in the power and energy sectors, but in displacement of metallurgical coal and steelmaking applications, in alumina, in cement kilns, those industries where significant greenhouse gas emissions are generated and decarbonization opportunities are very, very difficult to achieve. And so we're proud of the opportunity we have ahead. We're very, very proud of the opportunity we have ahead. And what I would like to end with is a note that President Biden actually commented on quite specifically, which is the importance of things and emerging technologies like carbon capture and sequestration. And so when you think about biomass energy taking a renewable resource generating the utility of power and heat and utilization in other industrial applications, and then capturing and sequestering that carbon, which are activities that are being undertaken today by two of our largest customers, Drax in the United Kingdom and Ørsted in Denmark. We really have an opportunity to think about wood not just being a part of our past, but really an indispensable part of our future. And so as we open the lines to Q&A, I, of course, would invite people to learn more about us, learn more about our sustainability journey. You can find the information and details on our website, our recently published corporate sustainability report, and otherwise would welcome and the opportunity to answer some Q&A from the audience, and certainly appreciate being included in today's discussion.
Great. John, thank you very much. I am going to go to the Q&A. We do have one question, not second one coming. First one from Stephen Hall. All this forest management and replanting sounds great, but there is reportedly a huge problem in destroying critical forest diversity with a tree monoculture that in turn becomes a waiting victim to infestations and disease. What's the answer? Over to you.
Oh, such an important question.
Yeah.
And I didn't give it enough life in the way that we described the track and trace system. So that component of biodiversity and preserving natural habitats and ensuring that you don't actually end up converting critical places like bottomland hardwoods into monoculture pine plantations, really, really important. And so we have very specific conditions within our contractual relationships with our supply chain partners, our loggers, and our landowners that really focus on those areas of biodiversity. Where landowners don't have other choices, and again, people invest in forest land because they're seeking to preserve or grow value. We also invest very heavily in conservation efforts. And so both direct purchases of fully conserved land so that it can never be converted away, especially around riparian areas and others, really, really important. And evolving markets like carbon offsets and areas where we can bring new financial tools to the market to give landowners alternatives to preserve those very, very special places, both of specific tree characteristics as well as the biodiversity characteristics, giving those landowners, which are generally private landowners, the tools to preserve value so that there's no longer a trade-off between needing to harvest and needing to preserve that biodiversity. Really great question.
Next, John, thank you. From Joe, can you comment, what are the rates of carbon capture? Do you have the data on the rates of carbon capture you achieve by plants that you feed versus coal in these plants? Do you have a comparison?
So the carbon capture component is really the next phase of evolution in the power generation sector that we serve. What our utilities report today in terms of what they report to their regulators under their various jurisdictions is that the utilization of wood pellets in lieu of coal displaces between 80 and 85% of the equivalent coal-fired emissions on a life cycle basis. I think the evolving efforts that people like Drax and people like Ørsted in combination with Acre Carbon Capture and a couple of other folks, what they're beginning to achieve is much greater utilization as they capture carbon emitted through the flue gas and the solvent and the ultimate recapture and precipitation out of that into fully condensed carbon that they re-inject. I think those rates continue to be in development, and how far and what that frontier looks like really is technology people that are much smarter than me, but we're pretty excited about what the opportunity ultimately holds.
Thank you. Clock is running, but what do you think about biochar from wood for carbon sequestration?
You know, again, it ultimately depends upon the mass energy balance of the process that gets it there. What we have seen in a couple of different technology applications is as we've approached that either through kind of a multi-stage pyrolysis or maybe a low temperature gasification approach. When you can make the mass energy balance work right, it can be very interesting, but sometimes those things can tend to run away from you. And if you're not really careful about the calculated overall balances, you're not ultimately achieving the benefit you really hope. But again, great opportunities, particularly as biochar and other wood-based products for absorptions. The absorbent market, I think, is one that's very, very interesting. And the utilization of things like that in lieu of their fossil fuel counterparts can be a really important sink. that may be not quite as well utilized as it could be.
On the wire, how do you contribute to replanting? What's your supply chain? Replanting and growing, is that your business?
So we have a contractual obligation from our suppliers to replant from any tract from which we have participated in the harvest, and we audit and manage against that. So we do not take any land from land use conversions, and we ensure that our loggers and the landowners with whom we contract have the intent to replant. We go back and audit it.
Great. Okay, we're right on time, but we're closing out. Please explain just quickly existing emerging regulatory mechanisms that you have to prevent negative impacts of biomass.
To prevent negative impacts to biomass. Well, certainly, if we look at it from the forest product sector, the focus on sustainability, the requirements within some companies like Enviva and many of our aggregate wood products partners really focus on sustainability certifications and state level best management practices to ensure that anytime that we're touching the land, that good things happen after it, even after accounting for all of our activities.